Hi there everyone, hope you're doing well today. In this video, I'm going to introduce us to the problem of evil. So in this video, we're going to start out just by reviewing what we introduced as the ideas of a very traditional theism. Then we're going to introduce these ideas of evil and suffering in the world and show how they give rise to the problem of evil. And then we'll start to look at what would a solution look like. We won't actually give a solution, we'll just look at what a solution would need to do. So remember that theism is the view that a personal God or gods exist. And we're actually focusing more specifically on what we might call a very traditional form of theism that believes in one personal God and believes that that God is omnipotent, all-powerful, omniscient, all-knowing, and omnibenevolent, all-good. So one thing we notice about the world we live in is that it's imperfect. There's an abundance of both evil and suffering in the world. Now, we're going to use these words interchangeably just to mean bad things that exist in the world. Now, there might be important differences between the kinds of bad things that exist in this world, and maybe evil is one kind of bad thing and suffering is another kind of bad thing that exists. We might come back to those ideas, but for now, we're just going to use these words interchangeably. Now, here's some examples of the kinds of evil or suffering that we see in the world around us. I mean, the list can go on. We would be here forever if I tried to list all of the bad things that exist in this world. The existence of this evil and suffering that we see in our world can raise several kinds of questions. I mean, it might raise moral questions for how we ought to live our lives. So, what should we be doing to help minimize or prevent the suffering that we see in this world? It might also raise psychological questions. So, I mean, when people are suffering, oftentimes we want to comfort them to help them deal with the suffering that they're going through. And how can we provide that comfort or reassurance to those around us who might be suffering? What should we say to them? What should we do for them to help them get through that psychologically hard time? But there's also philosophical questions that might arise. So what should we think about the rationality of traditional theism given that suffering exists in the world? So we're going to be focusing on this philosophical question. So nothing we say is going to help you figure out how best you can prevent suffering in the world. It's not going to help you provide comfort to someone around you who might be going through a psychologically difficult time. And if you're going through a psychologically difficult time, nothing we say here is going to help you deal with that problem. I mean, you should go talk to a therapist, a psychologist, instead of talking to a philosopher necessarily. When we turn to the philosophical problem of evil, the idea is that the existence of evil can seem, at least at first, to make it irrational to believe in God, at least God as traditionally conceived. This is specifically a challenge to the rationality of belief in God. Now, some theists might agree that their belief is irrational, but claim that they believe in God anyway, that maybe they believe it not on any rational basis, but as a leap of faith, so to speak. Now, there's difficult and interesting philosophical issues lurking in the background. Like, is it okay to believe something on faith even if there's no evidence, even if there's evidence against it? That's a difficult issue that we're just not going to deal with in this particular part of our course. However, what I do want to point out about this is that you should note that that kind of view agrees that belief in God is irrational. That doesn't give a solution to the philosophical problem of evil because you're just admitting what it's trying to show, that this belief is irrational. A solution to this philosophical problem would attempt to show that the existence of evil does not make it irrational to believe in God. Over the past 50 years, philosophers have come to distinguish two forms of this philosophical problem of evil. The first version is known as the logical problem. This problem claims that the existence of evil makes it irrational to believe in God because God's existence is inconsistent with evil. The evidential problem claims that the existence of evil makes it irrational to believe in God because evil provides evidence that God's existence is unlikely. The difference between these problems is the way in which evil is said to make this belief irrational. So we're going to start out by talking about this supposed logical problem of evil. how could we turn this problem into a full argument? Well, the idea is that, well, if God, as traditionally conceived, were to exist, then evil wouldn't exist, since, according to the problem, it's impossible for both God and evil to exist at the same time. But as I mentioned earlier, it doesn't take much observation to notice that we live in a world where evil exists. Thus, it seems that God, at least as traditionally conceived, does not exist. Now, premise 2 seems like it's on pretty dang good ground. There are so many examples of evil and suffering that exist in this world. It seems impossible to deny that there is such a thing as evil. In fact, if you did deny that evil exists, you're going to have a whole bunch of other theological problems. So the key premise in this argument is this one that states that there is an inconsistency between God's existence and the existence of evil. Why should we believe that? Well, let's consider any example of evil or suffering. It doesn't matter what it is. It could be a really big evil, a really small evil. It could be a suffering, very big, very minor, any evil whatsoever. And just label it E. God's omnipotence seems to imply that God would have the power to prevent that evil. And God's omniscience seems to imply that God would know about the evil and know how to prevent it. And God's omnibenevolence seems to imply that God wouldn't want that evil to occur and would want to prevent that evil. A good person doesn't want other people to suffer, doesn't want evil things to happen. And so if God is supposed to be a perfectly good person, regardless of what the evil or suffering is, God must not want that evil to occur. And that leads to a more developed reconstruction of that logical argument from evil. The idea is, if God exists, then God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, at least from that traditional definition of God. If God is omniscient, then God knows about any evil. If God's omnipotent, then God has the power to prevent any evil. And if God is omnibenevolent, then God does not want any evil to occur. But if God knows about any evil, has the power to prevent it, and doesn't want it to occur, then evil would not exist. But as we said, evil does exist, therefore God does not exist. Now, one thing I want to point out here is that in order to solve this logical problem of evil, you do not need to give a proof that God exists. You don't even need to give any evidence that God exists. The logical problem claims that belief in God is irrational because it's inconsistent with the existence of evil. So to respond to this problem, you only need to prove that there is no inconsistency. So solving the problem doesn't require that you prove that God exists. It just requires that you prove the following claim, that it's possible for both God and evil to coexist. Theists usually attempt to prove the possibility that God and evil can coexist by trying to prove the following, that it's possible for God to have a morally sufficient reason for allowing evil and suffering in the world. Now, this is often, but not always, explained in terms of the possibility that evil is connected to a greater good, thereby justifying allowing that evil to exist. So let's consider an example that's going to provide an analogy that will help you understand how this strategy is supposed to work. Let's consider the following claims. Sam is a loving parent to his children. Sam voluntarily inflicts unwanted pain on his children. Despite the fact that those might seem inconsistent, they are not. Vaccines inflict physical and emotional pain on my children. Nonetheless, I do voluntarily give my children vaccines. This is consistent with the belief that I am a loving parent because I have morally sufficient reasons for allowing that pain to be inflicted on my children. A loving parent protects their child's health, and vaccines are necessary for achieving that greater good. And so as a loving parent, in order to achieve that greater good, I thereby allow this pain to be inflicted on my child. Now, by itself, this doesn't provide a solution to the problem of evil. A solution requires us to prove that it's possible for God to have morally sufficient reasons for allowing evil or suffering. Now, the vaccine case proves that it's possible for a morally good human to have sufficient reason for allowing suffering, but it doesn't prove that it's possible for a perfect God to have sufficient reason for allowing evil or suffering. Now, you might be thinking, wait, what are you talking about, Sam? Doesn't it show that God could have a greater good that God's getting by allowing these evils? Doesn't this prove that it's possible for God to have a morally sufficient reason, since that evil that God allows could be connected to some greater good, even if we don't know what that greater good is? It's important to realize here that not just any greater good would provide a morally sufficient reason to allow evil or suffering. Let's consider that vaccine example again. I have a morally sufficient reason to allow that pain and suffering because it's necessary for me to protect my child's health. But if it was possible, if I could give the same protection, if I could achieve that greater good without the suffering of the vaccine, then as a loving parent, I should do that instead. In that case, I wouldn't have a morally sufficient reason for allowing that evil, that pain and suffering. However, as a matter of fact, I lack the power to protect my child's health in this way without giving them the vaccine. And now that might hint at why this doesn't prove the possibility of God having morally sufficient reasons for allowing evil. This strategy still needs to show that it's possible for there to be a greater good, such that it's necessary for God to allow that evil, such that God could only get that good by allowing the evil. But the argument from evil is trying to show that that's impossible. Consider any evil again that might lead to a greater good. It seems that in the case of God, the following would be true. If God's omnipotent, then God would have the power to get that good without that evil. And if God has the power to get that good without the evil, then God doesn't need to allow E for the sake of that greater good. And if God doesn't need to allow that evil in order to get that good, then that greater good wouldn't be a possible reason for God to allow that evil. And so it looks like if you want to use this strategy, you're going to have to do a lot more work here. Now, there's another issue as well. So it isn't clear that the mere existence of a greater good would provide a morally sufficient reason, even if that evil was necessary to get that greater good. Let me give you an example here. Imagine that harvesting the organs of an innocent living person, Bob, is the only way to save the lives of 5 innocent people. So in order to get the greater good of 5 people living rather than just 1 person living, I would need to harvest the organs of that innocent person. So even though that might be true, it would be extremely wrong to allow Bob's organs to be harvested. We cannot use Bob as a means to that greater good. There's something morally problematic with achieving the greater good in that way. It is common to use this greater good strategy to try to prove the possibility that there's possible reasons for God to allow evil. But the strategy will only provide a solution once you prove that there are possible greater goods that God could only achieve by allowing evil. And you also have to show that those possible greater goods would provide a morally sufficient reason to allow that evil. So you have to prove that the greater goods are not like the case of Bob and the organ harvesting. There's 2 kinds of philosophical responses to this problem of evil. There are defenses and there are theodicies. So when someone gives a defense, they attempt to identify some possible reasons a perfect God would allow evil to exist. But a theodicy attempts to go further and attempts to identify not just some possible reasons, but attempts to give the actual reasons that a perfect God would allow evil to exist. A solution to the logical problem of evil only requires that you give a defense. You don't need to prove what God's actual reasons are. I mean, that might be impossible. I mean, you can't expect human beings to know the mind of God. However, it's not sufficient just to say maybe there's some reasons God allows evil. To prove that God's existence is consistent with evil, you're going to need to describe a possible situation where God has sufficient reasons for allowing evil. You're going to have to give a defense. Instead of identifying actual reasons God allows evil, you need to provide examples of possible reasons God would allow evils. So that's all for the video today. I'll see you all next time.